The candles were still burning when the door came apart, not knocked, not opened. Apart, the cheap hollow wood splitting at the hinge in one violent crack, and for a full second I didn't understand the sound, because 5 seconds earlier the only sound in that cramped apartment had been my son blowing out a single crooked candle on a cake I'd bought half price from the bakery that was about to close. The candle smoke was still curling upward when the cold hit me. Rain-wet air, and underneath it the sharp copper bite of cordite, the kind of smell that doesn't belong anywhere near a 5-year-old's birthday party. I remember thinking, stupidly, that I hadn't locked the second bolt. He filled the doorway before I even saw his face. Just the shape of him first, tall, broad through the shoulders in a way that made the frame look narrow, rain sliding off a charcoal coat like it didn't dare cling to him. Then the hallway light caught his eyes, and my stomach dropped through the floor, because I would know those eyes anywhere. Obsidian, flat and cold and utterly, terrifyingly calm. 5 years. 5 years of moving apartments every 8 months, of flinching at slammed car doors, of teaching my son to stay quiet when strangers knocked, and he found us anyway, on a Tuesday, over a cake with one candle. Nobody in the room moved. My son's small hand found mine under the table, sticky with frosting, and I felt every muscle in my body lock into place like a held breath. He didn't look at me first. That was the part that undid me. His gaze went straight past me, past the peeling wallpaper and the mismatched chairs, and landed on my son, found him with a precision that felt like a blade sliding home. "Happy birthday," he said. 2 words, no warmth in them, no cruelty either. Just fact, delivered the way a man reads a verdict, dropped into a room that had, moments ago, only held candlelight and cheap cake and the small, ordinary happiness I had fought 5 years to build. I finally found my voice, and it came out wrong, thin and cracking. "Get out." He didn't answer me. He crossed the small room in 4 strides. 4, I counted them, my mind grasping for something solid while everything else came apart, and crouched in front of my son's chair. Up close, the rain had darkened his hair to black ink, and a thin scar I didn't remember cut white through one dark brow. His hands, when he reached into his coat, were steady, scarred across the knuckles. A gold signet ring caught the candlelight. He set something on the table beside the cake. It took me a moment to understand what I was looking at. A stone, black and faceted, easily the size of a knuckle, throwing back light like it was swallowing the room whole. A black diamond, on a birthday cake beside a $5 box of matches shaped like the number 5. "For my son," he said, and the words seemed to cost him nothing at all to say, though they cost me everything to hear. The words landed like a hand closing around my throat. "He is not," I started, and my voice broke apart before I could finish the lie I'd told for 5 years, the lie I'd built an entire hidden life around. His eyes came up to mine then, finally, and there was nothing kind in them, nothing that remembered the man I'd once let myself love in another lifetime, before I understood what his family was, what his blood cost. Just a terrible, patient stillness, like something coiled and waiting. "Don't," he said quietly. "Not tonight, not after everything it cost me to find you." Behind him, 2 men in dark suits filled the broken doorway, silent, hands loose at their sides, in a way that wasn't relaxed at all. I felt the apartment shrink around us, the walls I'd once thought of as safe now nothing more than thin plaster between us and the rain. My son looked up at him, not afraid, not yet, just curious in the fearless way small children are curious about anything that glitters, and reached one small hand toward the diamond. "Don't touch it," I said too sharply, and pulled his hand back into my lap, and the stranger crouched at my son's chair watched me do it with an expression I couldn't read at all. He rose slowly, unfolding to his full height, and the room seemed to tilt around the axis of him. From his coat pocket he drew a lighter, gold, engraved, worn smooth at the edges from years of the same restless motion, and flicked the lid open with his thumb. Not lighting anything, just opening it, closing it. Opening it again, the small metallic click loud in the frozen silence, like a countdown only he could hear. "You have 60 seconds, he said, and his voice hadn't risen at all, hadn't changed in pitch or heat, which was somehow so much worse than if he'd screamed it, to pack a bag. I stared at him. Somewhere outside, thunder rolled low over the city, and the cheap birthday candle guttered out on its own in the sudden draft from the broken door. "Or I burn this building down," he said, snapping the lighter shut one final time, "with you inside it." The city fell away beneath us in a smear of red and gold, 10,000 windows stacked into the dark like something that had been set on fire from the inside. I hadn't spoken since the tarmac, neither had he. My son had fallen asleep against my shoulder somewhere over the river, exhausted past fear, and I sat with my arm locked around him while the helicopter's blades chopped the silence into pieces. Across the narrow cabin, he sat with one ankle crossed over his knee, entirely unbothered by the altitude, the noise, the wreckage he'd made of my life in under an hour. The cabin lights turned his obsidian eyes to something closer to glass. He hadn't looked at me since we boarded. He was looking at a folder instead, thin, black, embossed with a crest I didn't recognize and didn't want to. He slid it across the narrow table between us without a word. I didn't touch it at first. I just looked at the shape of it, the weight it seemed to carry even closed, and I thought about every version of this moment I'd imagined over 5 years of running. All the ways I'd pictured him finding me, none of them this quiet, none of them this clinical. "Open it," he said, "not a request." Inside, the paper was heavier than any document had a right to be, and the first line told me everything I needed to know before I read the rest. A marriage contract, dated, sealed. My name already typed into the blank beside his, as though my consent had been a formality decided somewhere else, in some boardroom I would never see. "You can't be serious," I said, and my voice sounded far away even to me. "I am never anything else." He said it flatly, the way another man might comment on the weather, and reached into his jacket for a pen, not offering it, just holding it, waiting, the gold clip catching the cabin light. "You will sign it before we land. You will take my name. You will live under my roof." In exchange, no one touches him. His gaze flicked, briefly, to the sleeping weight against my shoulder, and something moved behind his eyes that I didn't have time to name before it was gone. "That is the entire negotiation, and if I don't sign, then I put you both back on the street I found you on," he said, "and I let my uncle's men do what they've been trying to do for 5 years. The helicopter banked, and the skyline tilted sideways in the window. 1,000 lit towers sliding past like a held breath. I thought of the black vans I used to see idling outside grocery stores. I thought of the 2 apartments I'd fled in the middle of the night without packing a single photograph. I thought of my son's laugh, and how I would trade every scrap of my own future to keep hearing it. I thought of the version of him I'd known before all of this, younger, quieter, a man who used to bring me convenience store coffee at dawn and pretend it was somehow a great sacrifice. That man felt like a story I'd told myself once, a photograph left behind in an apartment I could never go back to. This man, sitting across from me with a pen he wasn't offering, felt like the only truth that had ever mattered. I took the pen. My hand was shaking so badly the first letter of my name came out jagged, more scar than signature, the ink darker than ink should be, closer to something wet and red under the cabin's low light. I didn't let myself look up at him while I finished it. I couldn't. When I finally did look up, he wasn't watching the contract, he was watching me, with an expression I would spend months trying to translate, not triumph, not even relief, something colder and more complicated than either, something that looked almost like grief wearing victory's clothes. He took the folder back, closed it without checking my signature, as if the outcome had never once been in doubt. His phone buzzed against the table between us. He glanced down, and I watched the muscle along his jaw go rigid, watched something shudder close behind those obsidian eyes before he angled the screen away from me. But not fast enough. I caught 6 words glowing on the lock screen before the darkness swallowed them again. Asterisk, the target has been acquired. Awaiting orders to execute. The elevator doors opened onto silence so complete it had a texture, a kind of hush that money apparently bought along with everything else. Marble underfoot, pale as bone, stretching toward floor-to-ceiling glass that turned all of Seoul into a glittering, distant thing. Something to look at, never to touch. My son woke as we crossed the threshold, and I felt him go rigid in my arms before he let out a small, involuntary gasp, the kind children make when the world exceeds what they thought was possible. He wriggled down before I could stop him, small sneakers slapping against marble as he spun in place, head tilted back to take in ceilings higher than our old apartment building. I didn't move. I stood in the entryway of a home I hadn't chosen, in a life I hadn't agreed to beyond a signature bled out of me at gunpoint of circumstance, and I felt something close over my chest like a hand. He watched me from a few steps away, hands in his pockets, that same unreadable stillness. "There are people here to help with him," he said, nodding once toward a woman in a dark uniform who had appeared soundlessly near the kitchen, as if she'd been standing there the whole time, waiting to be noticed. "A tutor, a doctor on call, anything he needs." "He needs his mother," I said. "He has his mother." His eyes moved over me, briefly, unreadably. "He also has a target on his back that didn't exist an hour ago. Those two things are not separate anymore." I didn't have an answer for that. I watched my son press both palms flat against the cold glass wall, staring down at the city lights like they belonged to him now, and something in me broke a little further, quietly, without sound. I thought of our old kitchen table, the one with the wobbly leg I'd fixed with a folded receipt, the smell of instant noodles on a Tuesday night, the small, ordinary joys I'd built for him out of almost nothing. None of it existed here. This apartment didn't smell like anything at all. No cooking, no laundry, no life, just stone and steel and the faint, sterile hum of climate control, as though even the air had been filtered until it forgot how to carry a scent. The woman in the dark uniform stepped forward and asked, in careful, formal Korean, whether the young master would like something to eat. My son turned to look at me first, seeking permission the way he always did before accepting anything from a stranger, and I nodded, throat too tight to answer aloud, hating that I had to nod at all, hating that this was now the shape of our lives, strangers asking permission from me to feed my own child in a house I hadn't chosen. The apartment, if it could even be called that, this sprawling, sterile expanse of steel and stone, swallowed us both. He showed me nothing personal in it, no photographs, no warmth, just wealth arranged with surgical precision, and I understood, walking through it, that I had traded one kind of hiding for another. Before, I had hidden from him. Now I would hide inside him. Night came fast over the skyline, the way it always did in cities that never quite went dark, just changed which lights were burning. My son fell asleep in a bedroom bigger than our old apartment, exhausted into a peace I envied him for, and I stood outside his door for a long time before I made myself walk toward the room I'd been told was mine. It was down a long corridor, past a study with its door shut, past a wall of black and white photography I didn't stop to examine. The room itself was beautiful in the cold way everything here was beautiful, a bed too large for one person, a window that looked out over rooftops instead of alleys. I tried the door once I was inside. An old habit, a reflex built over 5 years of needing to know my own exits. The handle turned. The door opened onto the hallway, empty and lit low. I told myself that was enough. I told myself, lying in a stranger's bed in a life I hadn't asked for, that an open door meant something like safety. I was still telling myself that when I heard it, faint but unmistakable through the quiet, the heavy click of the oak door at the end of the hall, the one leading to his study, the one I hadn't heard open, only now, hours later, heard lock from the outside. The dress arrived before breakfast, carried in by a woman who didn't meet my eyes, laid across the bed like an offering, white silk, so fine it felt like water between my fingers, cut in a way that made it clear no one had asked my opinion on the matter. A note pinned to the collar in sharp, slanted handwriting, * dinner at 8, do not be late. I put it on because I didn't see another option that didn't end with someone else putting it on me. The silk moved strangely against skin that had spent 5 years in second-hand cotton, too light, too aware of itself, like wearing a held breath. I stood in front of the mirror for a long time before I made myself leave the room, and even then I moved through the apartment quietly, the way I used to move through unfamiliar buildings when I was still running, cataloging exits out of habit I couldn't unlearn. That was how I found myself outside his study. The door was open a crack, not locked this time, not sealed, just carelessly ajar, spilling a blade of lamplight into the dark hallway. I should have walked past it. I told myself that even as I stopped, even as I leaned toward the gap, drawn by something I didn't examine too closely, inside the room was all dark wood and low light, and he stood at the center of it with his sleeves pushed to the elbow, tie already discarded somewhere, his usual stillness replaced by something coiled and terrible. A man knelt on the floor in front of him, hands zip-tied behind his back, face already swollen on one side. I didn't hear what the man had done. I only heard him beg, the words tumbling out fast and broken, and I watched him reach for the crystal ashtray on the desk with the same unhurried precision he'd used to slide a marriage contract across a helicopter table. The sound it made against the man's jaw was not loud. That was the part I hadn't expected, hadn't been prepared for, how quiet violence could be in a room with good soundproofing, how efficient, how utterly without theater. He didn't shout. He didn't even seem angry, not in any way I recognized as anger. He simply worked, methodical and merciless, while the man on the floor sobbed something that might have been a name, might have been a prayer. I should have looked away. I told myself that later, lying awake, replaying it. I should have backed silently down the hallway and pretended I'd never seen any of it. Instead, I stood frozen in the gap of the door, one hand pressed flat against the frame, silk cold against my collarbone, and watched a man I had married that morning become someone I didn't recognize at all, or maybe, worse, someone I recognized completely, some deeper truth about him finally surfacing where I could no longer pretend not to see it. He straightened eventually, breathing even, not remotely winded, and reached for a folded handkerchief on the desk. He wiped his knuckles slowly, one at a time, the fabric coming away dark, and it was in that unhurried, almost tender gesture, cleaning blood off his own hands with the same care another man might use to polish a watch, that he looked up. Straight through the gap in the door, straight at me. Neither of us moved. The lamplight sat between us like something solid, and I watched his gaze travel once, slowly, from my face down to the white silk at my throat, and back up again, and I understood, with a cold certainty that settled into my bones like the temperature of the room itself, that he had known I was standing there the entire time. My pulse hammered so loud I was certain he could hear it from across the room, certain the silk at my throat was moving visibly with every ragged breath I couldn't quite steady. The man on the floor whimpered, forgotten between us, and still neither of us looked away, the silence stretching long enough that it became its own kind of conversation, saying things neither of us would have dared say with actual words. The private dining hall smelled of sandalwood and old money, low lacquered tables set with more silverware than I'd ever owned in my life, candlelight throwing long shadows across faces I didn't know but instinctively feared. 20 of the most powerful men in Seoul's underworld sat around that table, and I sat among them in a beaded black dress that felt more like armor than fabric, my husband's hand resting, deceptively casual, at the small of my back. I felt the old man's eyes on me before I ever saw his face. He sat at the head of the far table, leathery skin drawn tight over sharp bones, silver hair slicked back with military precision, thick gold-rimmed glasses catching the candlelight so I couldn't quite see what was behind them. He wore a dark green hanbok hybrid suit that made him look like something out of another century, and his thumb moved constantly, restlessly, over a heavy jade ring, tapping it against the table's edge in a rhythm that set my teeth on edge. "So," the old man said, not bothering to lower his voice, "this is the girl who hid my nephew's son from this family for 5 years." Every conversation at the table stopped. "Uncle," my husband said, and the single word carried a warning in it I felt more than heard. The old man didn't so much as glance at him. His eyes stayed on me, cold and assessing, the way a butcher looks at meat before deciding where to cut. "In my day," he said, "a woman who stole a Syndicate heir didn't survive to sit at this table." I felt my husband's hand go rigid against my back. Beside the old man, a younger elder, thick-necked, ringed fingers, a sneer already forming, leaned forward with the confidence of a man who'd never once been made to answer for his cruelty. "Perhaps she should be reminded what happens to women who steal from this family," he said, and reached across the table toward me, fingers closing loosely around my wrist. I didn't even see my husband move. 1 second his hand was at my back. The next, a steak knife, the same one that had been resting beside his untouched plate, was buried through the elder's hand and into the lacquered wood beneath it, pinning flesh to table in a single motion too fast to follow. The elder's scream came a half-second after the shock did, a raw, animal sound that filled the silent room. Nobody else moved. Nobody else even breathed. My husband hadn't raised his voice at all. He simply withdrew his hand, unhurried, and reached for his wineglass as though nothing at all had happened, as though the man across the table wasn't staring in horror at a blade nailing his own hand to solid wood. "Touch her again," he said quietly, "and it won't be your hand." The old man across the table hadn't flinched, hadn't so much as blinked behind his thick gold-rimmed glasses. He only smiled, thin and cold, his thumb resuming its slow, deliberate tap against the jade ring, and I understood, watching that smile, that I had just witnessed something far more dangerous than the violence itself. I had witnessed a man taking careful, patient note. I didn't speak again for the rest of the meal. I couldn't. When it finally ended, I rose on unsteady legs and walked ahead of my husband toward the door, desperate for air, for distance, for anything that wasn't that room. The old man caught my arm as I passed his seat, not hard, almost gentle, which was somehow worse, and leaned close enough that I caught the scent of sandalwood and something colder underneath it. "I should have pulled the trigger 5 years ago," he whispered. 3 days of uneasy quiet had almost convinced me it might be safe to let my son be a child again. The private park sat behind 2 layers of security, high walls draped in ivy, guards stationed at intervals so unobtrusive I'd almost stopped noticing them. My son ran across the grass in a red jacket, laughing at nothing in particular, chasing a ball he'd insisted on bringing, and for the first time since the door had splintered open on his birthday, I let myself believe, just slightly, that we might survive this. I was watching him climb the low slide, counting his small victories the way I always did, when the gate at the far end of the park groaned. It wasn't a sound that belonged there. I knew that before I understood why, some old, animal instinct from 5 years of running recognizing danger before my mind caught up. Black vans, 3 of them, nosed through the gate in a formation too precise to be anything but planned, and men poured out of them in dark clothing, weapons already drawn, moving low and fast across grass that had been, 30 seconds earlier, the safest place I knew. "Down!" someone shouted, one of our guards, but the word barely registered before the world narrowed to a single point. For one suspended, useless second, everything slowed. The ball my son had brought rolling unattended across the grass. A bird startled up out of the ivy along the wall. The guard nearest me reaching for something at his hip too slowly. All of it happening at a distance, as if I were watching it through glass. Then the slowness broke apart all at once, sound crashing back in at full volume, and there was no more room in me for anything except the 20 feet between myself and my son. My son, 20 feet away. Frozen on the slide, red jacket bright against gray sky, staring at the men crossing the grass with the confused, uncomprehending stillness of a child who doesn't yet understand what a gun is. I don't remember deciding to run. I only remember the grass under my bare feet. I'd kicked off my shoes without noticing, and the terrible slowness of the distance between us, the way 20 feet stretched into something endless while suppressed gunfire chewed up the earth around me in small, vicious eruptions. I reached him half a second before the world would have ended without me. I don't know how I found the strength to lift him, how adrenaline rewired every muscle I had into something capable of scooping a 40-pound child off a slide and pulling him into my chest in one motion, curling my whole body around his as I went down into the grass. I felt him gasp against my collarbone, felt his small hands fist into my shirt, and I pressed my palm flat over his ear, like that alone could shield him from the chaos breaking open around us. Screaming, the wet, percussive cough of suppressed rounds. Somewhere behind me, one of our guards went down with a sound I would hear in my sleep for weeks afterward. I twisted just enough to look back toward the men crossing the grass, and that was when I saw it, a small, steady red dot tracing across my own chest, drifting with terrible patience toward the exact center of me, the man behind it not even bothering to hurry. As if my death was already a foregone conclusion he was simply taking his time to arrive at. I curled tighter around my son, made myself as large as I could over his small frame, and closed my eyes, waiting for a sound I already knew I wouldn't survive long enough to fully hear. The armored sedan hit the curb at a speed no car should survive, and he was already moving before it fully stopped, door thrown open, body launched from the vehicle in a single violent arc that shouldn't have been physically possible, black coat snapping behind him like something with its own fury. I saw him for only a fraction of a second before he collided with us both. He hit me low, at the shoulder, driving my body and my son's together down into the cover of the stone fountain at the park's edge, and the impact knocked the air from my lungs even as understanding arrived a half-second later. He had thrown himself, full weight, full speed, directly into the path meant for me. The gunfire that followed sounded different once we were behind the fountain, muffled, chipping stone instead of flesh. I clutched my son against my chest with both arms, felt his small heartbeat hammering against mine, and looked up in time to see my husband's face contort, not with pain exactly, something quieter and more devastating than pain, a kind of grim, private acknowledgement, as his body jerked sideways. "Get down," he ground out, voice tight, and used his own body to press us both flatter against the stone. I didn't understand yet, not fully. The gunfire thinned, then stopped altogether as his men closed in around the park's perimeter, shouting orders, and in the sudden relative quiet I finally registered the warmth spreading against my arm where his side pressed to mine. Wrong, wet, spreading too fast to be anything but catastrophic. I couldn't finish it. Fine, he said, which was such an obvious, immediate lie that it frightened me more than the truth would have. He held position over us until the last of the gunfire died completely, until his men had swept the park and the black vans had peeled away in retreat, engines screaming into the distance. Only then did some of the rigid tension go out of his shoulders, and only then did I see how much of it had been holding him upright. He slid down the curve of the fountain slowly, controlled even in this, as if some final reserve of will insisted on dignity even now. His charcoal suit, the same impeccable bespoke armor I'd watched him wear like a second skin for days, had gone black and heavy along one side, soaked through in a way fabric should never be soaked through. "Someone get the car," he said, to no one and everyone, his voice thinner now, and it was the thinness that frightened me most, the crack finally showing in a man I'd started to believe had none. My son whimpered against my chest, and I pressed my lips to the crown of his head without looking away from the man slumping against cold stone in front of us both. "Look at me," I said, my voice breaking apart. "Look at me, stay with me." His obsidian eyes found mine, and for one unguarded moment, all the ice in them dissolved into something raw and human and afraid, not of dying, I understood, watching him, but of what dying would leave behind. His hand moved, slow and deliberate, toward mine, closing my fingers around the heavy gold signet ring he pulled from his own hand. His lips parted. A wet, terrible sound came from his chest before words finally followed, barely more than breath. "If I don't wake up," he whispered, "burn the Empire to the ground." His eyes rolled back, and his body went completely, terrifyingly still against the stone. The safe house smelled of antiseptic and old rain, a low-ceilinged room somewhere south of the city that his men had produced out of nowhere, the kind of place that only existed because men like him always needed somewhere to disappear. A single lamp burned over the narrow bed where he lay, shirt cut away, the wound in his side an angry, swollen thing I didn't have the medical training to properly understand, but understood well enough to fear. His lieutenant had shown me where the supplies were kept, and then left without a word, trusting me, or perhaps simply out of options, with a needle, thread, and a man's life. My hands shook through the first stitch. They steadied somewhere around the fifth, some cold, practical part of me taking over where panic had been, the same part of me that had kept my son fed and hidden for 5 years on nothing but instinct and refusal to fail. He didn't make a sound through most of it, jaw locked, sweat beading along his hairline, fever already climbing in his skin under my fingers. It was somewhere past the 10th stitch that the fever won. "Why did you hide him?" he said, voice rough and unmoored, eyes glassy and fixed somewhere past my shoulder. Not the cold, measured voice I'd learned in the space of a week. Something rawer, something that had been waiting 5 years to ask. 5 years, you let me believe. "I didn't let you believe anything," I said, my hands still moving, still working thread through skin because stopping felt more dangerous than continuing. "I ran because your uncle put a gun to my stomach while I was still carrying him. Because he told me very clearly that a bloodline problem could be solved before it was ever born." Outside, rain ticked steadily against the shuttered window, the only clock in a room otherwise stripped of time. I kept my eyes on the wound, on the thread, on anything that wasn't his face, because looking at his face made it too easy to remember the boy who used to bring me coffee at dawn, and I couldn't afford that memory tonight, not with his blood still drying under my fingernails. His hand found my wrist, weaker than it should have been, but insistent. "You should have come to me." You were 3,000 miles away closing a shipping deal, I said, and heard for the first time 5 years of buried fury break loose in my own voice. Your uncle was standing in my kitchen with a gun. There was no version of that night where I had time to call you. He didn't answer. His grip loosened, fever pulling him under again, and I finished the last 2 stitches in silence, my vision blurring more than once, though I couldn't have said whether it was exhaustion or something closer to grief. I was cleaning the last of the blood from his side when his fever broke. It didn't break the way fevers were supposed to break, slow, sweating, gradual. It simply stopped, all at once, his skin cooling under my hand like a switch had been thrown somewhere inside him. His eyes opened, and every trace of the raw, unguarded man who'd gripped my wrist a moment before was gone, replaced by something flat and depthless and entirely, coldly awake. He sat up too fast for a man who should not have been able to sit up at all. "Get the phone," he said to the doorway, voice steady now, in a way that chilled me more than the fever had, and his lieutenant appeared instantly, as if he'd been standing just outside the whole time, waiting for exactly this. My husband's eyes hadn't left mine, but whatever had lived behind them a moment ago, whatever had asked me why, whatever had sounded almost human, had been replaced entirely by something with no room left in it for anything but purpose. "Lock the doors," he said quietly. Into the phone his lieutenant pressed into his hand, his gaze still fixed on me, unreadable and absolute. "Call the executioners." He was gone before dawn, a small army of black cars pulling away from the safe house in formation, and the silence he left behind felt heavier than any noise could have. My son and I were moved back to the penthouse under guard, 4 men stationed at the door, 4 more somewhere below, a small fortress assembled around us in the space of a single morning. I told myself it was enough. I told myself that a man capable of pinning another man's hand to a table with a steak knife had built walls that nothing could breach. The power went out a little after 9. It wasn't gradual. One moment the apartment was lit in its usual sterile brightness, and the next every light died at once, the hum of central air cutting off so completely the silence that followed felt like its own kind of sound. My son startled awake on the couch beside me, small hand finding mine in the dark on instinct alone. "Mom?" His voice was thin, uncertain. "It's okay," I said, though every nerve in my body was already screaming otherwise, already cataloging exits, the way 5 years of running had trained me to. "Stay close to me." Red emergency lighting flickered on along the baseboards a moment later, throwing everything into a low, bloody glow, and somewhere down the hall I heard raised voices, our guards, sharp and urgent, footsteps moving fast across marble that had been silent an hour before. I pulled my son toward the vault room off the master bedroom, the one my husband had shown me the first night, quiet and almost apologetic, the one place in the penthouse built to withstand exactly this kind of night. Steel walls, a door thick enough to stop anything short of an explosive. I'd thought, when he showed it to me, that I would never need it. We moved through the dark apartment in a crouch, my hand pressed over my son's mouth, not to silence him, he hadn't made another sound since the lights died, but because I needed the contact, needed to feel his breath against my palm, to convince myself he was still solid, still here, still mine. The red emergency lighting threw everything into long, distorted shadows, familiar furniture turned strange and threatening, and every corner we passed felt like it might hold something waiting. Somewhere behind us, glass shattered. A single sharp crack, then silence, and I didn't stop to find out what it meant. I only pulled my son faster down the hallway, my bare feet silent on marble that had felt, only days ago, like the floor of a fortress, and now felt like nothing more than open ground. I got the outer door shut and locked, my son pressed silent and trembling against my side, and for one suspended moment I let myself believe we had made it, that whatever was happening beyond those steel walls could not reach us here. That was when I heard the vault door's inner mechanism turn. Not from the outside, not someone trying to force their way in, from the inside, a slow, deliberate click of a lock releasing, the heavy door easing open on its own, as though someone had known the code, had been given the code, had been standing inside this supposedly impenetrable room the entire time, waiting patiently in the dark for exactly this moment to arrive. The men who came through the opening vault door moved like they'd rehearsed it, silent and efficient in a way that told me this had never been a breach at all. It had been an appointment. I shoved my son behind me on instinct, but there were 4 of them, and I was one woman with bare hands and 5 years of fear as my only weapon. I fought anyway. I clawed at the first man's face hard enough to draw blood, twisted free of a second one's grip long enough to put my whole body between them and my son, screamed his name into the red emergency light like sound alone could summon help that wasn't coming. I bit down on a wrist that closed around my arm and tasted copper before a fist caught me across the jaw and the world went white at the edges. "Mom!" My son's scream cut through the ringing in my ears, and I turned toward it with everything I had left, watching in helpless horror as one of the men wrenched him bodily out of the corner where I'd shoved him for safety. "No, no, please!" The words tore out of me raw and useless, and I lunged, got one hand around my son's small wrist before a boot connected with the back of my knees and drove me down onto the marble, hard enough to steal the air from my lungs entirely. I looked up in time to see the roof access door thrown open above us, rain-slicked concrete and a helicopter's rotor already spinning, blades chopping the night into strobing fragments of black and red. They dragged my son toward it, and I crawled after them across wet stone, fingers scrabbling for any purchase at all, screaming a sound that didn't feel like it belonged to me anymore. "Please," I begged, to men who weren't listening, to a sky that offered nothing back. "Please, take me instead. Take me, not him." They ripped him from the last man's grip, just long enough to hand him up into the waiting helicopter, and I saw his small face, tear-streaked and terrified, reaching back toward me across a gap that felt like the entire width of the world. "Mommy." I got close enough to touch the helicopter's skid before someone's boot caught me square in the chest and threw me backward onto the concrete, the impact driving every scrap of breath out of my body. I lay there, stunned, rain hammering down against my face, and watched through blurred, streaming eyes as the helicopter lifted off the roof, banking hard into the dark, carrying my entire reason for surviving 5 years of running up into a sky I had no way of following into. I never saw what he did to get the shipping yard's location. His men found me on the roof, half drowned in rain and grief, and by the time I was carried back down into the penthouse, my husband was already gone, had already left the moment word reached him, already descended into whatever version of himself lived beneath the tailored suits and quiet menace, the version I'd only glimpsed once, through a cracked study door. I heard about it later, in fragments, from a lieutenant too rattled to fully meet my eyes while he told me. A flooded basement somewhere south of the city. A captured traitor, one of the guards who'd let the vault door open from the inside, tied to a chair in ankle-deep water while my husband asked him, once, with terrible patience, where the helicopter had taken my son. The man hadn't answered fast enough. There had been a blowtorch. There had been questions asked a second time, a third, my husband's voice never once rising above a conversational register, even as the room filled with a smell no one who was there would ever fully describe to me. And then, finally, the traitor had screamed the answer loud enough that it hadn't needed to be asked a 4th time. The Incheon shipping yards. My husband had dropped the still-burning torch into a puddle of gasoline on his way out of the room. He hadn't looked back to watch it catch. I heard all of this standing in a penthouse gone eerily quiet, my hands wrapped around a cup of tea I couldn't make myself drink, every part of me suspended somewhere between horror and a desperate, ugly gratitude I didn't have room to examine yet. I understood, hearing it, that the man who had once slid a marriage contract across a helicopter table with icy detachment no longer existed in any recognizable form. There was only this now. Something scorched down to its foundation, burning everything in its path toward a single point on a map. I didn't wait for permission. I found the nearest car, and a driver too frightened of contradicting me to refuse, and told him to take me to the docks. The shipyard was already a war by the time we arrived, muzzle flashes strobing along container stacks like violent, silent lightning, my husband's men flooding the docks in numbers that should have made the outcome obvious, and somehow, in the chaos, didn't. I slipped from the car before it had fully stopped, ignoring every shouted order to stay back, moving through the smoke and noise with a singular, narrowing focus that left no room left in me for fear. The air tasted of salt and diesel and gunpowder, thick enough to coat the back of my throat. and every few seconds the world lit orange where a stray round found something flammable among the stacked containers. I stayed low, the way I'd learned to stay low crossing playgrounds under fire, moving between shadows with a steadiness that frightened me more than the chaos did, some cold, focused version of myself I hadn't known existed until tonight. I found a dropped weapon beside a fallen man before I let myself think too hard about what I was doing with it. It was heavier than I expected, warm from his hand, and I made myself hold it anyway, made myself remember that somewhere beyond this dock my son was safe, only because men were dying to keep him that way. I saw the old man before he saw me. Leathery skin, silver hair plastered to his skull with sweat, thick gold-rimmed glasses askew, backing toward a smaller boat at the dock's edge, with 2 remaining guards flanking him, his jade ring flashing once under a security light as he gestured his men forward. My husband stood 20 feet from him, blood-soaked, breathing hard, pinned behind a shipping container by cover fire that showed no sign of stopping. I didn't think. I aimed the way 5 years of fear had somehow, without my knowing it, taught me to aim, and pulled the trigger. The old man went down screaming, clutching his leg, his last guard turning in shock toward the direction the shot had come from, toward me, exposed and unmistakable in the open, just long enough for my husband to close the gap between them and end it. Silence fell over the docks in pieces, gunfire dying out in a ragged wave as word spread among hundreds of men who'd spent the night fighting for a throne that had just decisively changed hands. I lowered the weapon with shaking arms and watched my husband stand over his uncle's crumpled body, chest heaving, blood-soaked and unrecognizable from the immaculate man who'd once flicked a lighter open and shut in my kitchen. Hundreds of gangsters along the dock lowered their weapons at once, an entire underworld holding its breath, waiting in the sudden quiet to see who would claim what remained. They brought my son to me across the wet concrete before anyone said another word, and I went down onto my knees to meet him, gathering him into my arms so hard he made a small, startled sound, his tears soaking into my shoulder as mine soaked into his hair. I don't know how long I knelt there, rocking him, saying nothing at all, because there was nothing left in me that could form words yet. When I finally looked up, my husband had crossed the distance between us. He stood over me for a long moment, swaying slightly on his feet, blood-soaked and hollowed out by the night, obsidian eyes finding mine across the wreckage of everything we'd survived to reach this point. And then, in front of every surviving member of an underworld that had spent 5 years hunting the woman kneeling in front of him, he let his gun fall from his hand into the mud. And he went down onto his knees in front of me. No one moved. No one breathed. Hundreds of men who answered to no one bowed their heads instinctively, some reflex older than any of them fully understood, watching their absolute, untouchable boss kneel in the mud before a woman he had once dragged into a marriage at gunpoint of circumstance. He reached for my hand, the one still raw and bruised from clawing at men on a rooftop, from pulling a trigger I'd never imagined myself capable of pulling, and pressed his lips to my knuckles with a gentleness that undid every wall I had left standing. Then he rose, turned toward the hundreds of men watching in the wreckage of the docks, and his voice, when it finally came, was no longer cold. It was something else entirely, something that had burned everything false away and left only this. Rain had started again, fine and cold, settling over the docks like ash after a fire finally allowed to burn itself out. I looked at the men lowering their heads in the mud, at my son's small hand curled tight in mine, at the ruined, magnificent wreck of the man standing beside us both, and I understood that whatever life waited for us past tonight, it would never again be one I had to hide. "Bow," he said, "to your new queen."